Welcome to episode 228 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this album by Archie Shepp from 1965, Fire Music, which this one in particular is an early 70s reissue. You can tell because it has those so charming blue-green concentric circles in the label, which mark it out from that period, but I think it still sounds pretty good. So on this record, Archie Shepp, who 6 months before had recorded his debut for Impulse Records, For Train, is now hurtling headlong into the avant-garde and to freer sounds. And this record arguably is where he lands on the tone and the approach that he would use for the next few years, not just musically, but also politically and socially. He was hugely affected by Malcolm X and hugely affected by Malcolm X's assassination, an event which really hardened his approach to his own political consciousness, to Pan-Africanism, and these are themes that you see explored by Shepp all the way through his recordings until the early 1970s, when, like a lot of other jazz musicians, he returns to a what we call more traditional, more blues-based sound. This record's kind of the takeoff point for a lot of that. It's a little bit jumbled, a bunch of different styles, but it's fascinating, it's wonderfully played, and it's a really important landmark in the development of free and politically conscious jazz. As I mentioned in previous reviews, Archie Shepp was born in Florida. He moved to Philadelphia when he was about 10 with his family. He's a student of music, he's a student of theater, he's also actually a playwright, still going these days, at 84, I think, something like that. When he moved to New York in 1959, he had a fairly accelerated introduction to the world of the avant-garde, which was really only getting going with certainly the work of Ornette Coleman that year. One day in 1960, after playing clubs around town for the better part of a year, he bumps into Cecil Taylor on the street. Now, he knew who Cecil Taylor was, but he didn't know that Cecil Taylor knew him from a hole in the wall. But Taylor says to him, "Are you Archie Shepp?" And Shepp goes, "Yeah." He says, "Do you want to play on a record?" So Shepp jumps at the chance because he greatly admired Taylor's work and was fascinated. In fact, he'd been fascinated with a lot of the avant-garde work. He didn't really necessarily understand it musically by his own account, but he loved the sound and he wanted to know more. So this was a great opportunity. So in he goes to the studio with Taylor and with Taylor's trio, and they make the record which eventually becomes The World of Cecil Taylor. Shepp is one of the great players of 60s jazz, and he's also one of the great intellectuals of 60s jazz. And there are two figures who have a profound influence on his development. Coltrane, of course, is one. I talked a little bit about their relationship in my review of For Train. The other is Taylor, and Taylor is a very magnetic figure for Shepp. Shepp sees him, as he says, kind of the James Baldwin of music. Taylor himself was not just a musician, he was a poet, he was very socially and politically conscious, and Shepp was very much drawn to that. And Taylor was also able to help Shepp decipher what was going on in the world of free jazz and the avant-garde, and how in turn it was possible to shed or transcend prior musical traditions and influences to allow for freer expression. That's all the good stuff. The downside of playing with a galaxy brain like Taylor is that neither the audience nor sometimes even his fellow musicians could really keep up with his musical vision. For instance, the number of bars that you would have set aside in the Taylor composition for a solo or just for a passage of music, which would commonly be in multiples of 8 in most jazz performances, 16 bars for a solo, sometimes 32 bars for a solo, were in, relatively speaking, weird amounts of bars. So it might be 60 bars or 100 bars. And that and the free jazz, which Taylor was rapidly exploring, tended to alienate audiences. And they suffered all kinds of walkouts and sometimes audience protests and fights over their music right there in the club. It was a complex and sometimes challenging environment for Shepp, and one night at the 5 spot, he's not quite sure where a particular song is going to end. He's looking for cues from Taylor, he's not really getting them or he's misinterpreting them, and he ends up playing a solo which is 20 minutes too long. The set ends, they're packing up for the night, and Taylor walks over to Shepp and says, "We're going to get another guy." So that was the end of his time with Taylor. Bit of a setback, but by this point he was thoroughly enmeshed in the whole bohemian intellectual world of the avant-garde in New York and amongst the Harlem intellectuals who were so influential in the day. People like Amiri Baraka, then known as Leroy Jones, who would go on to found the Black Arts movement, who writes the liner notes for this particular record, were now part of Shepp's circle. Shepp, as I mentioned, was also profoundly influenced by Malcolm X, and it was Taylor, of course, who had introduced him to his writings. And if he idolized Coltrane in terms of the freeness and the sheer innovation of his playing and his expression, where he diverged from Coltrane was that where Coltrane was perhaps the great spiritualist of mid-60s free jazz players, Shepp's turn was decidedly political. After leaving Taylor, it didn't take him too long to get some traction in his own recording career. His first release under his own name. It was a joint release with Bill Dixon, the Archie Shepp Bill Dixon Quartet, which comes out on Savoy in 1962. He then joins the New York Contemporary Five with John Chica and Don Cherry. And then, increasingly moving into Coltrane's orbit, Coltrane gets him a deal with Impulse Records. He releases Four for Train in 1964. He then plays on the Love Supreme sessions, although his playing isn't actually released until subsequent expanded editions, not the original release. He shares two sides of a record with Coltrane on the New Thing at Newport release, and he also participates on Coltrane's landmark free jazz album, Ascension. But in terms of his own career, it's the release in 1965 of this record, Fire Music, which is the first marker he lays down in terms of the politically conscious direction of his music. And he was not turning back. He wasn't taking any shit from the white establishment or bourgeois critics. As he wrote in Downbeat around the time this record was released in 1965, "If you're bourgeois, you have to listen to it on my terms. I will not let you misconstrue me. That era is over." This record's recorded in February and March 1965 at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Unsurprisingly, for an Impulse release, Bob Thiele's in the producer's chair and Rudy Van Gelder is the engineer. The album takes its title from an African musical tradition, and also, incidentally, Fire Music is the title of a new documentary on free jazz, which is by a guy called Tom Sergel and apparently is excellent, although it hasn't made it to this little backwater yet. Hopefully it will soon. Archie Shepp's on tenor saxophone. Ted Curson is on trumpet, and he's somebody that Shepp knew from their time playing together with Cecil Taylor in the early 60s. Joseph Orange is on trombone. This is actually his first appearance on record, but he'd go on to play with all kinds of folks, including Herbie Mann, the Palmieri brothers, and Lionel Hampton. Marion Brown is on alto sax. He was a fixture of the avant-garde scene in New York around the time, and he too, like Shepp, uses Coltrane's assistance to get himself a record deal with Impulse a little bit later on. Reggie Johnson's on double bass, and like Joseph Orange, this is his recording debut, but he'd go on to be on over 100 recording sessions. Finally on drums is Joe Chambers, and he'd go on to play in all kinds of jazz, funk, and fusion records in the 1970s. On one song, Malcolm, Malcolm, Semper Malcolm, all the rest of the players clear out, and Shepp is joined by David Eisenson on bass and J.C. Moses on drums. Side one starts with Hambone, which is an Archie Shepp composition. This is a fascinating kind of a hybrid track. There's this almost a big band feel. It sounds much bigger than the six musicians who are actually on the track, but in terms of harmony and overall musicality, the discordant approach is about as far away from Ellington and Basie as you can possibly get. In fact, I'd say it's much more like Mingus from the same era, but there are also some what you might call contemporary R&B or soul sounds and a bit of a feel to the music, particularly in the rhythm track, particularly under Joseph Orange's trombone solo. The other track on side one, Los Olvidados, is another Shepp composition. It's another one that has a bit of a Mingus-like feel. It's a tribute to a film with the same name, which is a bit of a stark cinematic piece of socialist realism from Mexico. It has some tremendous playing. In particular, Curzon's playing both with and without the mute, and Chambers' drumming. Both are excellent in this track. Side two begins with Malcolm, Malcolm, Semper Malcolm, which is a bit of a poem set to music. Lyrically very raw, obviously dealing with the assassination. The two accompanists that come in, Eisenson and Moses, play a major part in setting the mood. After three Shepp tracks, we now have two standards to close out the record. The first of those is by Ellington, Prelude to a Kiss. This is a very spooky rendition of that classic. It's kind of almost a Tennessee Williams feel to some of Shepp's playing on this record and around this time. Sort of sultry, desperate, a little bit cynical. Anyway, fascinating. And then the record closes with The Girl from Ipanema. In the years which immediately preceded the release of this record, there were probably 200 or 300 recorded versions of this song worldwide. It's probably the most covered song by a Brazilian composer ever, and it was just everywhere during the bossa nova craze. This is easily the least accessible of all those versions. When this record came out, people that had been following Archie Shepp's career knew what a big musical mind he had, but this is still a major stepping out. It certainly goes beyond the more careful and reverent work of his debut Four for Train, and here, while stepping out in some really quite wild ways, he still manages to build on the work and the style of some of the greatest composers of the day. For some people, this is a little bit too eclectic to be a great record, but I'm not quite sure how you contain all of Archie Shepp's genius in just one style. Of course, he's going to be all over the map. I think it's an essential part of any free jazz collection. It's an essential part of collecting Archie Shepp, and for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.